In the shadowed halls of medieval power, where kingdoms were built on the broken dreams of children, one small girl would become both queen and prisoner before her 13th birthday. Isabella of France, known to history as the She-Wolf, began her reign not with triumph, but with tears she was forbidden to shed. Her story reveals the brutal machinery of medieval politics, where children were currency and marriage was warfare by other means. The year was 1308, and across the English Channel, preparations were underway for a wedding that would reshape two kingdoms. But this was no fairy tale union. The bride was 12 years old, speaking only French, terrified of the sea voyage that would carry her to a foreign throne. The groom, Edward II of England, was 24, more interested in his male favorites than in producing heirs with his child bride. Isabella's wedding dress, crafted from cloth of gold and ermine, weighed nearly as much as she did. Contemporary chronicles describe how the young queen had to be helped to walk down the aisle of Westminster Abbey, not from nervousness, but from the literal weight of her ceremonial burden. The irony was not lost on observers. A child crushed beneath the symbols of power she was too young to understand, let alone wield. The marriage ceremony itself lasted 4 hours, conducted entirely in Latin that Isabella barely comprehended. She stood silent and still as archbishops blessed a union that would define the next 50 years of English history. When the golden crown was placed upon her head, witnesses noted that her neck bent under its weight, a prophetic image of the burden she would bear. As the cathedral bells rang out across London, celebrating the new queen, Isabella of France began her descent into a golden cage. She had been transformed from a protected French princess into an English political asset. Her childhood officially ended by the weight of a crown she had never asked to wear. The feast that followed would be her last moment of innocence. Seated at the high table beside a husband who barely acknowledged her presence, surrounded by courtiers speaking a language she was still learning, Isabella began to understand the isolation that would define her queenship. She was no longer a child, yet not quite a woman. Caught in the terrible limbo of royal childhood, the wedding night, mercifully brief in contemporary accounts, marked the beginning of Isabella's education in the harsh realities of medieval marriage. At 12, she was expected to produce heirs for England while navigating the deadly currents of court politics. Her French attendants had been dismissed, her toys packed away, her childhood formally buried beneath layers of silk and protocol. The architecture of arranged marriage, medieval royal marriage, was a sophisticated instrument of statecraft, as calculated and brutal as any siege engine. Children like Isabella were identified as diplomatic assets from birth. Their future spouses selected based on territorial advantages, trade agreements, and military alliances. The human cost of these arrangements was considered irrelevant to their political utility. The negotiations for Isabella's marriage began when she was barely walking. French and English diplomats spent years haggling over her dowry, the territorial concessions that would accompany her, and the specific terms of the alliance her marriage would cement. She was discussed in the same language used for livestock or property, her personal wishes never entering the calculations. King Philip of France, Isabella's father, viewed his daughter's marriage as the cornerstone of his English policy. By placing a French princess on the English throne, he hoped to neutralize England as a military threat and potentially gain influence over English foreign policy. Isabella was his most valuable bargaining chip, worth more than gold or territory because she could produce future kings with English royal blood but French loyalties. The marriage contract, preserved in the English royal archives, is a masterpiece of medieval legal brutality. It specifies Isabella's dowry, her household arrangements, even the number of French servants she would be permitted to retain. Most chilling are the clauses governing her personal conduct. She was forbidden from corresponding with her family without English approval, prohibited from leaving England without royal permission, and required to submit to regular examinations to verify her continued virginity until the marriage was consummated. Edward III's own preferences were well known to the French court. His passionate relationships with male favorites, particularly Piers Gaveston, were the subject of diplomatic gossip across Europe. Philip IV understood that his daughter was being married to a man who would likely neglect her, but this was considered acceptable as long as she eventually produced legitimate heirs. The age difference between Isabella and Edward was typical for royal marriages of the period, but it created a particularly toxic dynamic. Edward had spent his youth in military campaigns and court intrigue, while Isabella had been raised in the protected environment of the French royal nursery. Their marriage represented not just a political alliance, but a collision between adult cynicism and childhood innocence. Isabella's education for queenship began immediately after the betrothal was announced. French tutors taught her English customs, English law, and the genealogies of English noble families. She learned to sign her name in English script, to recognize the faces of important courtiers, and to navigate the complex protocols of English court life. What she was never taught was how to protect herself from the psychological isolation that awaited her. The golden cage of queenship. Westminster Palace, Isabella's new home, was a magnificent prison designed to showcase royal power while constraining royal freedom. The Queen's quarters, though luxuriously appointed, were essentially a gilded cage, where every aspect of her daily life was regulated by protocol, supervised by appointed guardians, and subject to political manipulation. Isabella's daily routine was choreographed down to the minute. She woke to the sound of chapel bells, attended morning prayers with her English ladies-in-waiting, breakfasted on prescribed foods at a designated time, and spent her days in pursuits deemed appropriate for a queen. Reading was permitted, but only books approved by her English guardians. Music was encouraged, but only songs that would not remind her too strongly of France. The young queen's correspondence was monitored with the thoroughness of a military intelligence operation. Every letter she received was opened and read by English officials before being delivered. Her own letters were similarly scrutinized, with any passages deemed politically sensitive either censored or used as evidence of disloyalty. This surveillance extended to her conversations, with several of her English ladies-in-waiting functioning as informants for the king's council. Physical isolation compounded Isabella's emotional imprisonment. The queen's quarters were located in a separate wing of the palace, accessible only through guarded corridors and monitored doorways. She could not walk in the gardens without escorts, could not visit the kitchens or stables without permission, and could not leave the palace grounds without a formal royal procession that required days of planning and approval. Isabella's relationship with Edward II, during these early years, was characterized by polite indifference punctuated by moments of shocking cruelty. The king, consumed by his passion for Piers Gaveston, treated his child bride as an inconvenient political necessity. He would go weeks without speaking to her directly, communicating through intermediaries even when they were in the same room. The psychological toll of this treatment manifested in ways that contemporary chroniclers noted with concern. Isabella, once described as a lively and intelligent child, became withdrawn and silent. She developed nervous habits, biting her nails until they bled, pulling at her hair during formal ceremonies, and startling violently at unexpected sounds. These were the visible signs of a mind under constant stress. Food became both comfort and battlefield for the young queen. The elaborate meals served in her quarters were often left untouched, not from lack of appetite, but from the understanding that eating in public was a performance, where every gesture would be analyzed for political significance. Isabella learned to hide her hunger as she hid her homesickness, maintaining royal dignity while slowly starving emotionally and physically. The Piers Gaveston scandal. No aspect of Isabella's early queenship was more humiliating than her husband's public infatuation with Piers Gaveston, a Gascon knight whose influence over Edward II scandalized medieval England. The relationship between the king and his favorite was conducted with such openness that it made Isabella's position as queen a mockery, reducing her to a decorative afterthought in her own court. Gaveston had been Edward's companion since childhood, elevated to the earldom of Cornwall shortly after Edward's accession to the throne. Contemporary chroniclers described him as handsome, witty, and utterly without scruples, wielding his influence over the king to accumulate wealth and power while showing open contempt for English nobles and customs. His treatment of the young queen was particularly cruel, referring to her publicly as the French wench and making jokes about her accent and mannerisms. The most damaging incident occurred during Isabella's coronation banquet, when Gaveston appeared wearing jewelry that had been intended as coronation gifts for the queen. The Earl had convinced Edward to give him Isabella's own presents, including a magnificent ruby necklace that had been crafted specifically for the occasion. Isabella was forced to watch her husband's favorite parade her stolen jewelry while she sat beside them, maintaining royal composure despite the public humiliation. Edward's favoritism toward Gaveston extended to matters of state protocol that directly undermined Isabella's queenly authority. During formal court ceremonies, Gaveston was seated at the king's right hand, the position traditionally reserved for the queen. When foreign ambassadors visited, they were instructed to address their formal greetings to Gaveston first, with Isabella receiving only perfunctory acknowledgement of her rank. The sexual nature of Edward and Gaveston's relationship, while never explicitly documented, was widely assumed by contemporary observers. Chronicles from the period describe the two men sharing private chambers, exchanging intimate gifts, and displaying physical affection that shocked even the relatively tolerant medieval court. For Isabella, watching her husband lavish on another man the attention she craved was a daily reminder of her own inadequacy and irrelevance. Isabella's French relatives, horrified by reports of her treatment, attempted diplomatic intervention. King Philip IV sent angry letters to Edward II, demanding better treatment for his daughter, threatening to withdraw French support for English military campaigns if Isabella's position was not improved. These interventions only worsened Isabella's situation, as Edward resented any suggestion that he should alter his behavior to accommodate foreign criticism. The Gaveston affair taught Isabella crucial lessons about the nature of power and the ruthlessness required to survive in medieval politics. She learned to watch carefully, to remember slights, and to plan for future opportunities to settle scores. The humiliation she endured during these early years would later fuel her transformation from victimized child bride to the she-wolf of France, capable of bringing down kings and favorites alike. The mechanics of medieval child marriage. The institution of child marriage among medieval royalty operated according to carefully developed legal and social frameworks that prioritized political utility over human welfare. Isabella's experience illuminates the systematic ways in which children, particularly girls, were transformed into political instruments before they were old enough to understand their fate. Canon law, the religious legal framework governing Christian marriage, technically required both parties to consent to the union. However, for children like Isabella, this consent was considered automatically granted by their parents or guardians. The concept of informed consent, as understood today, was meaningless in a system where children's preferences were legally irrelevant and practically unthinkable. The consummation of royal marriages was a public concern, monitored and documented with uncomfortable thoroughness. Isabella's marriage to Edward II was not consummated until she reached what medieval physicians considered physical maturity, around age 15. However, the 3-year delay between wedding and consummation created its own form of psychological torture, as Isabella lived in limbo between childhood and wifehood, subject to regular medical examinations to verify her continued virginity. Medieval medical understanding of child development was primitive and often dangerous. Court physicians prescribed treatments intended to accelerate Isabella's physical maturation, including herbal preparations and dietary regimens that modern medicine would recognize as potentially harmful. The young queen was subjected to regular examinations of her physical development, conducted by male physicians in the presence of court officials, experiences that would be recognized today as systematic abuse. The political calculations behind Isabella's marriage extended to the specific timing of various milestones. Her first pregnancy was planned to coincide with favorable astrological conditions and political circumstances. When she failed to conceive immediately after consummation, court astrologers and physicians were consulted to determine the optimal timing for future attempts, treating the young queen's reproductive capacity as a matter of state security. Isabella's household during these years was carefully constructed to serve political rather than personal needs. Her English ladies-in-waiting were selected for their family's loyalty to Edward II, rather than their ability to provide companionship or comfort to a homesick teenager. Her French attendants had been systematically replaced with English personnel, severing her last connections to the culture and language of her childhood. The psychological impact of this systematic isolation was compounded by the complete absence of any concept of childhood trauma or mental health care. Isabella's obvious distress was interpreted through the lens of female weakness, rather than recognized as the natural response to systematic abuse. When she displayed symptoms of what modern psychology would diagnose as depression and anxiety, medieval observers attributed her condition to excess of feminine humors or insufficient religious devotion, the birth of heirs, and the weight of dynasty. Isabella's first pregnancy, achieved when she was 17, transformed her from ornamental queen to crucial dynastic vessel. The child she carried represented not just the future of the English throne, but the vindication of her marriage's political purpose. However, pregnancy in medieval courts was fraught with dangers, both medical and political, turning what should have been a joyous time into a period of intense scrutiny and anxiety. The announcement of Isabella's pregnancy was treated as a state secret until the quickening was confirmed, around the 4th month. Royal pregnancies were political events that could affect everything from military campaigns to trade negotiations, making the Queen's condition a matter of international diplomacy. French and English observers watched Isabella's figure for signs of the royal heir that would cement the Anglo-French alliance. Medieval obstetrics was a deadly combination of superstition, primitive medicine, and political interference. Isabella's diet, exercise, and daily activities were prescribed by court physicians, whose primary concern was producing a healthy male heir rather than protecting the queen's well-being. She was forbidden certain foods, required to drink specific herbal preparations, and subjected to regular examinations that prioritized the child's development over her comfort or dignity. The birth of Edward III in 1312 was a moment of triumph that briefly elevated Isabella's status at court. She had finally fulfilled her primary function as queen, producing a male heir who secured the succession and validated her marriage. However, this success came at a terrible personal cost, as Isabella's role as mother was immediately subordinated to her function as royal breeder, with courtiers already speculating about when she might produce a second son. Isabella's relationship with her infant son was mediated through layers of protocol and political calculation. Royal children were raised by appointed nurses and tutors rather than their parents, and Isabella's contact with Edward III was limited to formal ceremonies and supervised visits. The boy, who would one day become one of England's greatest warrior kings, barely knew his mother during his crucial early years. A separation that served the political function of preventing maternal influence over future royal policy. The pressure to produce additional heirs continued throughout Isabella's fertile years, with each pregnancy monitored as carefully as a military campaign. Court physicians tracked her menstrual cycles, prescribed fertility treatments, and advised on optimal timing for conception. When pregnancies ended in miscarriage, as several did, Isabella faced not just personal grief, but political criticism for failing in her primary royal duty. The psychological toll of this medicalized approach to motherhood was severe. Isabella was expected to display maternal affection during public ceremonies while maintaining emotional distance that would allow her children to be used as political pawns. When her daughter Joan was betrothed in infancy to a Scottish prince, Isabella was required to celebrate the arrangement publicly while privately grieving the loss of another child to political necessity. The Dispenser, Tyranny, and Growing Rebellion. Following Piers Gaveston's execution by rebellious barons in 1312, Edward II's affections transferred to Hugh Despenser the Younger, whose influence proved even more destructive than his predecessors. The Despenser tyranny, as contemporary chroniclers called it, created the conditions that would transform Isabella from passive victim into active conspirator against her husband's reign. Hugh Despenser the Younger was, if anything, more ruthless and acquisitive than Gaveston had been. Where Gaveston had been content with wealth and status, Despenser sought to control the machinery of government itself, using his influence over Edward to eliminate political rivals and accumulate unprecedented power. His treatment of Isabella was calculated and cruel, designed to isolate her from potential allies while preventing her from developing independent political influence. Despenser's control over Edward II was so complete that the king ceased to function as an independent ruler. Royal appointments, military decisions, and diplomatic policies were all filtered through Despenser's influence, effectively creating a shadow monarchy that operated for the benefit of one man's ambitions. This arrangement reduced Isabella to a ceremonial figurehead, present at court functions, but excluded from any meaningful role in governance. The systematic persecution of Isabella's supporters began with the exile of her French relatives and advisors. Anyone suspected of loyalty to the Queen was dismissed from court positions, banished from England, or in some cases, arrested on fabricated charges. This campaign of isolation was designed to leave Isabella completely dependent on Edward and Despenser's goodwill. With no independent sources of support or information, Isabella's growing desperation manifested in increasingly bold attempts to communicate with her French relatives. Several of her secret messengers were intercepted, their letters providing Despenser with evidence of what he characterized as treasonous correspondence with foreign powers. These discoveries were used to justify even stricter surveillance of the Queen, reducing her freedom to move and communicate until she was virtually a prisoner in her own palace. The breaking point came when Despenser convinced Edward to seize Isabella's personal estates, the lands that provided her with independent income and the ability to maintain her own household. This confiscation left the Queen entirely dependent on royal allowances controlled by Despenser, effectively reducing her to the status of a pensioner in her own kingdom. Contemporary chroniclers noted the visible changes in Isabella during this period. The young woman, who had once been described as beautiful and vivacious, became gaunt and hollow-eyed. Her elaborate court dress, unable to disguise the physical toll of constant stress and humiliation. She began displaying nervous habits that court observers found disturbing: compulsive hand-washing, sudden startled movements, and a tendency to flinch when approached unexpectedly. The French mission and escape to freedom. In 1325, Isabella's opportunity for escape came disguised as a diplomatic mission. Charles IV of France, her brother, was threatening war over disputed territories in Gascony, and Edward II needed a trusted representative to negotiate a peaceful resolution. Isabella convinced her husband and Despenser that her French blood and family connections made her the ideal ambassador, a suggestion that would prove to be the most consequential decision of Edward's reign. The negotiations for Isabella's diplomatic mission revealed the extent to which she had learned to manipulate the men who controlled her life. She presented her request not as a desire for freedom, but as a sacrifice she was willing to make for the good of England. She emphasized her reluctance to leave her children, her preference for the safety of England over the uncertainties of travel, and her deep concern for Edward's welfare during her absence. Despenser's initial opposition to Isabella's mission stemmed from his accurate understanding of the threat she represented. A queen with access to French resources and freedom from English surveillance could potentially organize opposition to his regime. However, Isabella's careful presentation of the diplomatic crisis, combined with Edward's genuine need for a resolution to the Gascon dispute, eventually overcame Despenser's objections. The preparations for Isabella's departure were elaborate and carefully supervised. Her household was selected by Despenser, her instructions were written by Edward's council, and her movements in France were to be monitored by English agents. What appeared to be a diplomatic triumph for Isabella was actually intended as an extension of her imprisonment, conducted on foreign soil but under English control. Isabella's arrival in Paris in March 1325 marked the first time in 17 years that she had been beyond the reach of English surveillance. The psychological impact of this freedom was immediate and transformative. Contemporary French observers noted that the Queen seemed to shed years of visible stress within days of her arrival, her posture straightening, her voice regaining strength, her eyes losing the haunted quality that had characterized her final years in England. The French court's reception of Isabella revealed the extent to which her suffering had been observed and pitied by foreign observers. King Charles IV and Queen Jean treated their sister-in-law with a combination of affection and careful respect, understanding that she represented both a valuable diplomatic asset and a deeply traumatized woman who needed time to recover her strength and confidence. Isabella's transformation from diplomatic envoy to political refugee occurred gradually as she realized that returning to England would mean resuming her role as Despenser's prisoner. Her correspondence with Edward became increasingly evasive, her diplomatic reports increasingly critical of English policy, and her personal behavior increasingly independent of English expectations and control. The lover, the invasion, and the revenge. Isabella's relationship with Roger Mortimer, the exiled English baron, who became her lover and co-conspirator, represented more than romantic attachment. It was a strategic alliance between two victims of Despenser's tyranny, who shared the motive and means for spectacular revenge. Their partnership would transform Isabella from refugee queen into the architect of one of medieval England's most dramatic political upheavals. Roger Mortimer had escaped from the Tower of London in 1323, fleeing to France after his failed rebellion against Edward II and Despenser. A career soldier and experienced politician, Mortimer possessed the military expertise and ruthless pragmatism that Isabella lacked, while she provided the legitimate royal authority and French resources that his cause required. Their alliance was initially political, born of shared hatred for their common enemies. The personal relationship between Isabella and Mortimer developed within this political partnership, offering both participants emotional compensation for years of humiliation and loss. For Isabella, Mortimer represented the first man in her adult life who treated her as an equal partner rather than a political asset to be manipulated. For Mortimer, Isabella offered not just royal legitimacy, but intellectual companionship with a woman whose intelligence had been sharpened by years of surviving court intrigue. The planning of their invasion of England occupied the better part of a year, requiring careful coordination of military, diplomatic, and financial resources. Isabella used her position as queen to negotiate with Flemish merchants, German mercenaries, and French nobles, building a coalition united by their opposition to Despenser's influence over English policy. She proved surprisingly adept at military logistics, understanding that successful rebellion required more than righteous anger. Isabella's propaganda campaign preceding the invasion was a masterpiece of medieval political communication. She presented herself not as a rebellious wife, but as a concerned mother seeking to protect her son's inheritance from Despenser's tyranny. This narrative transformed what might have been seen as treason into a maternal duty, appealing to contemporary values that elevated motherhood above wifely obedience when the two came into conflict. The invasion force that landed in Suffolk in September 1326 was relatively small, comprising perhaps 1,500 men, but it represented a carefully selected coalition of Edward II's enemies. Isabella had learned from previous failed rebellions against her husband, understanding that success required not just military force, but popular support from English nobles and commoners who had suffered under Despenser's regime. Edward II's response to the invasion was characterized by the same indecision and dependence on Despenser that had marked his entire reign. Rather than mounting an effective military response, the king fled westward with his favorite, abandoning London and allowing Isabella's forces to occupy the capital without significant resistance. This collapse revealed the extent to which Edward's authority had been undermined by years of misrule and popular resentment. The terrible reckoning. The capture and execution of Hugh Despenser, the Younger, in November 1326 represented the culmination of Isabella's transformation from victim to executioner. The queen, who had once been powerless to prevent her own humiliation, now held the power of life and death over the man who had made her life a misery. Her handling of Despenser's fate revealed both her capacity for calculated cruelty and her understanding of the theatrical aspects of medieval justice. Despenser's trial was conducted with all the forms of legal procedure, but its outcome was predetermined by Isabella's desire for revenge. The charges against him included treason, tyranny, and the corruption of royal authority. But the underlying crime was his systematic destruction of Isabella's life and happiness. Contemporary chroniclers noted that the queen personally supervised the proceedings, ensuring that every detail of Despenser's crimes was publicly enumerated before his condemnation. The execution itself was designed to match the cruelty that Despenser had shown to his own victims. He was hanged, drawn, and quartered in the traditional manner reserved for traitors. But Isabella ordered that he be kept alive through as much of the process as possible, prolonging his suffering in deliberate contrast to the quick deaths he had arranged for his enemies. The queen watched the execution from a specially constructed platform, her face reportedly showing no emotion as her tormentor died. Edward II's fate was more complex, involving both personal and political calculations. As Isabella's husband and her son's father, he could not be simply executed like Despenser, but neither could he be allowed to remain king. The solution was forced abdication in favor of 14-year-old Edward III, with Isabella and Mortimer serving as regents until the young king reached majority. The deposition ceremony at Kenilworth Castle in January 1327 was stage-managed to emphasize Edward II's voluntary surrender of the crown. Isabella attended the proceedings, witnessing her husband's humiliation with the same composed demeanor she had displayed at Despenser's execution. The man who had once ignored her at court functions now knelt before representatives of her government, formally surrendering the authority he had never learned to exercise responsibly. Edward II's subsequent imprisonment at Berkeley Castle was intended to remove him from political life, while preserving the fiction that he remained alive and well. Isabella's role in planning his captivity remains historically controversial, but contemporary evidence suggests that she was deeply involved in determining the conditions of his confinement. The former king was held incommunicado, prevented from communicating with potential supporters or plotting his restoration. The mysterious death of Edward II in September 1327, officially attributed to natural causes, but widely suspected to be murder, marked the final act of Isabella's revenge. Whether she directly ordered her husband's killing or simply created conditions that made it inevitable, his death removed the last threat to her regency and her son's secure tenure on the throne. The she-wolf's reign and ultimate downfall. Isabella's regency, conducted in partnership with Roger Mortimer from 1327 to 1330, represented the only period in her adult life when she wielded real political power. The woman who had been treated as a decorative ornament for nearly 2 decades now governed England with a combination of intelligence, ruthlessness, and theatrical flair that earned her the nickname She-Wolf of France. The early years of the Regency were marked by competent administration and successful military campaigns. Isabella and Mortimer ended the expensive and unsuccessful Scottish wars that had drained Edward II's treasury, negotiating a peace treaty that recognized Scottish independence in exchange for substantial financial payments. This pragmatic approach to foreign policy demonstrated Isabella's understanding that effective government required more than royal dignity and ceremonial display. Isabella's personal transformation during the Regency years was remarkable. Contemporary observers noted that she seemed to grow taller and more commanding, her voice becoming stronger and more authoritative. She dressed magnificently but practically, favoring rich fabrics and elaborate jewelry that emphasized her royal status while allowing her to move freely and participate actively in government business. The relationship between Isabella and Mortimer during this period was conducted with unusual openness for medieval royal circles. Rather than maintaining the fiction of a purely political partnership, they appeared together at court functions, traveled together on royal progresses, and made little effort to conceal their personal intimacy. This transparency was both politically risky and personally liberating for Isabella, who had spent years concealing her true feelings behind royal protocol. However, the Regency's success contained the seeds of its own destruction. As Edward III approached his 18th birthday, the legal justification for continued maternal rule became increasingly tenuous. The young king, encouraged by nobles who resented Mortimer's dominance and coveted the regent's accumulated wealth, began to chafe against the restrictions placed on his authority. Isabella's downfall came with shocking suddenness in October 1330, when Edward III staged a coup at Nottingham Castle. The young king, supported by a group of ambitious nobles, arrested Mortimer and assumed personal control of the government. Isabella, awakened by the sounds of struggle in the castle corridors, found herself a prisoner of her own son, the child for whose sake she claimed to have destroyed his father. The scene of Isabella's final confrontation with Edward III reveals the complete reversal of her fortunes. The queen, who had once commanded armies and negotiated treaties, now knelt before her 18-year-old son, pleading for Mortimer's life and her own freedom. Edward III's response was coldly practical. Mortimer would die as a traitor, but Isabella would be spared execution out of respect for her role as Queen Mother and her French royal blood. Epilogue. The Forgotten Queen's Legacy. Isabella of France lived for nearly 30 years after her fall from power, spending her final decades in comfortable but closely supervised retirement at Castle Rising in Norfolk. The woman who had once been called the She-Wolf of France faded from public memory, becoming a footnote to the more dramatic reigns of her husband and son. Her transformation from feared regent to forgotten dowager reveals the precarious nature of female power in medieval politics. The final decades of Isabella's life were marked by a deliberate retreat from political involvement. She maintained a modest household, received a generous pension from her son, and occupied herself with religious devotions and charitable works. Contemporary accounts suggests that she found a measure of peace in this enforced retirement, perhaps for the first time since her childhood in France. Isabella's relationship with Edward III during her retirement years was complex and carefully managed. The king visited his mother occasionally, treating her with formal respect while maintaining clear boundaries around her influence. She was permitted to attend important court ceremonies and family celebrations, but always as an honored guest rather than a participant in government. This arrangement allowed both mother and son to maintain dignity while acknowledging the changed nature of their relationship. The historical assessment of Isabella of France has been complicated by the dramatic nature of her story and the gendered expectations of medieval chroniclers. Contemporary sources alternately praised her as a devoted mother and condemned her as an unnatural wife, reflecting the impossibility of judging a woman who had transcended traditional feminine roles. Modern historians have been more sympathetic, recognizing her as a victim of systematic abuse who found extraordinary means of resistance and revenge. Isabella's death in 1358, at the age of 63, was noted by chroniclers but not widely mourned. She had outlived most of her contemporaries, becoming a relic of an earlier generation's political struggles. Her funeral was conducted with appropriate royal ceremony, but without the elaborate pageantry that had marked other royal deaths. She was buried at Greyfriars Church in London, wearing the wedding dress she had first put on 50 years earlier as a terrified 12-year-old bride. The ultimate tragedy of Isabella's story lies not in its dramatic political events, but in its revelation of the systematic ways in which medieval society destroyed the humanity of royal children. Her marriage at 12, her isolation from family and culture, her reduction to a breeding function, and her eventual transformation into a political predator were all logical consequences of a system that treated royal women as valuable objects rather than human beings. Isabella of France remains one of history's most complex female figures, victim and perpetrator, child bride and regicide, forgotten queen and unforgettable legend. Her story illuminates the terrible costs of political marriage, the corrupting effects of absolute power, and the extraordinary resilience of the human spirit when pushed beyond endurance. She was, in the end, neither the innocent victim nor the calculating monster that various historians have portrayed, but something more disturbing and more human, a child broken by the machinery of medieval politics, who learned to use that same machinery for her own terrible purposes. The forgotten Queen of England was never truly forgotten because her story embodies truths about power, gender, and human nature that transcend the particular circumstances of 14th century politics. In her transformation from powerless child to powerful regent to powerless prisoner, Isabella of France lived through the complete cycle of medieval female experience, revealing both its possibilities and its limitations. Her legacy is not in the kingdoms she helped to shape, but in the enduring questions her life raises about the price of power and the cost of survival in a world that offered women few choices and fewer second chances.